Hello, AP Psychology students, and welcome to part 2 of Social Psychology. We're going to begin today by looking at attitudes and actions and how social influences affect both of those. So I want you to think about something. When you're looking at a political candidate, for example, do you favor them because of the way they look or their smooth talking voice? Or you're really listening to the substance of their message? You know, that note I have at the bottom is actually true. Presidents have gotten better looking by the standards of the day since the advent of television. John Kennedy was probably the first president that was really impacted by the widespread image of him on television, along with his very glamorous wife, Jackie Kennedy. And if we compare that couple to the Lincolns, Abe and Mary Todd there, you can see that they're quite a bit different looking. Now, this shouldn't seem to be something that is really important to us, but as it turns out in research, it is. And for people who just are looking at the superficial image or even just the way someone talks, they're going to be persuaded by something we call peripheral route processing. So peripheral route processing is really decision making and persuasion just through evaluating the confidence and the attractiveness of the messenger. Now, I'm not saying that John F. Kennedy didn't have a good message, but this is something that happens. I've seen it in my lifetime, and you will as well. And sometimes someone who is very confident and attractive may not have a really deep message, but people are persuaded by them because of those things. When we use central route processing, on the other hand, we're really more persuaded by the content of the message. Now, tragically, John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln have something in common. Both of them were assassinated while in office as the President of the United States of America. And, that was a very tragic end. And again, I'm not saying that either of them didn't have substance to their message, but the question is, and I'd like you to think about all of these social psych terms. Are there times when you're persuaded merely by confidence or attractiveness of the messenger? And I think it's important for us and incumbent on us to really be educated about the content of a message and not fall prey to peripheral route processing. Another topic in attitudes and actions is social roles. Assigned roles can affect both our attitudes and our actions. The evidence for this is very clear in Zimbardo's prison study. As Zimbardo created this simulation of a prison in order to study institutionalization of roles in a prison setting, well, he pretty much found what he was looking for, even though a lot of it was really done in a way that most psychologists would consider unethical. The people who were randomly chosen to be prisoners very quickly took up that mantle, and those who were randomly chosen to be guards started acting as one would expect a guard to act. I think what was most shocking about this particular study was that Zimbardo himself took on the assigned role of being a prison warden, and he really took it so seriously. It took his girlfriend, who is now his wife, kind of shaking him and saying, "Hey, Phil, you're taking this too seriously." But the reality is that we have social roles and they will affect our attitudes and our actions. So whether your social role is as a teacher like me or as a student like you, that's going to affect the way that we act within a classroom. It might affect our attitude. So be aware of that. Cognitive dissonance theory is really, really, really important. And I've talked about this one before, but I'm going to talk about it again. So when our thoughts or beliefs and actions are in conflict, we feel tension. We must change either our thoughts or beliefs or actions to come back into what we call consonance. So if we look at this example here, smoking cigarettes is unhealthy. You know that. You believe it. Your action, I smoke cigarettes. Let's replace that with weed, because I actually think more people smoke weed now than cigarettes. So you hear that it's unhealthy. You heard it from me, and yet you still do it. So if you look at the top, then you say, smoking weed, I'm replacing this for weed, is unhealthy. So you know what? I'm not going to smoke weed anymore. So you can make that top choice and bring yourself into consonance. Or you can make the bottom choice. The research on weed, it's not conclusive. It's just correlational. I'm going to keep smoking weed. Okay, so that's how we resolve our dissonance. We either have to change our actions or our thoughts. There was a movie some years ago about a Iraq soldier who enlisted to become, to try to root out weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And what happened was that the military was not getting any evidence that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And some of the soldiers really faced this cognitive dissonance. So what did they do in this case? In the case of most of the soldiers in Iraq, and even our U.S. involvement in Iraq, is we said, it's not so much about finding weapons of mass destruction. We want to bring democracy to Iraq. We want to overthrow Saddam Hussein. So the belief or the thought about why we were in Iraq basically changed. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have been there or we should have been there, but the mission and the goals of the mission changed somewhat because there was a lot of cognitive dissonance going on, both in American citizens and for the soldiers themselves. And this movie, The Green Zone, with Matt Damon, illustrated that conflict really, really well. So, do you conform to group norms? If you're in a group, do you follow the crowd, even if you disagree with them? Maybe they're saying something that you don't agree with, or they're chanting something, and what do you do? Conversely, or likewise, would you obey an authority just because they were, an authority? Those are really important questions, and oftentimes we don't think about those situations, until we're in them. So I talked about this one already. Conformity was studied by Solomon Asch. He was a refugee from Nazi Germany, and he just was so intrigued by that question. Do people often follow the group majority just because the group is in the majority, even if they know it's wrong? And so in his study of conformity, what he did was he used these lines, and he asked participants to raise their hand when he pointed to the line that matched this line. And what he found out was that about 70% sided with the group, and they chose this line. Now, they knew that this line did not match this line, but some of them began to doubt their own perception. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'm not seeing this right. They must be seeing something I'm not seeing. And so they had all kinds of explanations for their conformity. It is really difficult to fight situational forces unless you're prepared mentally. A strong dissenter can influence conformity. So if there's even just one other person in your group that says, I'm not going to give into this, then, and you're prepared to, buck up against those situational forces, then you'll do it. Obedience to authority was demonstrated by Milgram's study on obedience, which was shocking, no pun intended, but sort of. And what Milgram did, and I'm sure you all remember this, but the experimenter here was the authority figure. The teacher was actually the subject being watched, and the student was receiving fake shocks in response to memory questions by the teacher. And the really surprising result here is that 2/3 of the participants, the people who served in the role as teacher, complied to the full level of shock in Milgram's study. Now, this was far beyond what anyone would have predicted, because at some point on that, the machine that they had, the person who was playing the part of the student stopped screaming out altogether. And in fact, some of the subjects believed that they had actually killed the person who was behind the wall. Some further research has definitely confirmed Milgram's finding, although his original study would not be done in the way that it has been done now because of ethical concerns. But here's some things that influence obedience. Modeling. If you see someone else modeling that obedience, you might fall into the same pattern. If the victim is remote and could not be seen nor heard, then obedience is less likely to happen. If someone is under direct supervision of the authority, as they were in Milgram's original study, and continuously telling them, you must obey, then they're more likely to comply. If the authority figure has a higher status, so in the original study, the authority figure was a Yale professor. That's a pretty high status, and that's going to also affect obedience. And if the victim is undervalued, and this is how we see and why we see things like the Holocaust occur, because a population of people had been systematically denigrated for centuries in Europe and really in many places around the world. So these are all things that affect obedience. And, I guess the takeaway from this is, yeah, we need to be obedient in a lot of situations. But if you're being asked to do something that is clearly wrong, what are you going to do about it? Groups. How do groups influence you? Do you perform differently when people are watching you? What happens when you're talking to people who are like-minded, maybe about Second Amendment rights, capital punishment, abortion? How does your conversation proceed? Do you continue to get more and more radical, or do you continue to invite differing points of view? Do you closely follow the norms of your social group, or do you break out once in a while? There are a couple of terms in this section that I'd like to go over. Social facilitation, I don't have a definition written here, so you can just kind of come up with it on your own. But I mean, the Minnesota Twins had a really good season in 2019, and they were just hitting home runs like you can't believe. The Bomba Squad, some fans wrote out in big letters. And you know what? Those Twins players, they probably really loved the fans being there, full stands. So social facilitation refers to the influence that groups have when they're watching you perform a task and they're cheering you on. Maybe you're just playing, I don't know, Smash Brothers or something like that, and you have a group cheering you on, and they facilitate your performance. Social loafing, on the other hand, this occurs in group settings all the time. You give someone a group project. My daughter complained about this all the time, even at the U of M. In chemical engineering, for goodness sake, they would be given group projects, and she was always the one that ended up doing most of the work. You know what I'm talking about. So social loafing is kind of a group norm in which everyone just gets kind of lazy. Loafing's not a term we use much anymore, but being a loafer meant to be someone who's kind of lazy. Living off of other people. So this picture illustrates that nobody's really highly motivated. Someone else will get it done. And finally, we're going to look at group influence today. I have 3 pictures here that illustrate the 3 concepts on this page. This first picture you may not recognize, but I do very well. It is a picture of the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. I was actually living in Florida when this happened, and it was pretty regular for us to go outside to watch the shuttles take off. They had a really beautiful, almost like jellyfish kind of trail that they left behind them. The day of the shuttle explosion, people came running up to the office. I hadn't gone down at the time, but some people came running up to the office and they said something went wrong. And, so we turn on the TV and we hear news that, this shuttle has exploded. And on it was the first civilian, a teacher. And it was shocking, but it wasn't. Because, we had experienced weeks of below freezing temperatures in Florida. And there were a lot of questions, even just from regular people in Florida. Were these shuttles designed to take off in sub-freezing weather? Was the equipment tested at below freezing temperatures? The citrus crops in Orlando were destroyed at that time. I mean, they had big nets over the trees, and they had flames, and they had fans trying to keep the orchards warm, and yet the Challenger went off. Well, what happened, most people say in retrospect, is groupthink. So there was one engineer in particular that said, we haven't tested those O-rings, and that's where the fuel comes from. And this O-ring keeps the fuel separate from the ignition. And eventually he gave in to the consensus of the group with much regret, I must say. And so that is groupthink. De-individuation is what occurs when we lose our personal identity because we're acting in a group. The group assumes responsibility for the behavior. You know, in pictures like this picture I have here of people saluting Hitler, this concept of de-individuation always just amazed me. I couldn't understand, and I still in some ways can't understand how people can come together and completely lose their sense of individual identity. And this is what happens when we see a group acting as a group and individuals not taking responsibility. Further, what we see when groups get together is something called group polarization. And this is a really powerful process. So let's say you do get a group together and you're talking about something like capital punishment. Yeah, you know, I don't really like capital punishment, but I think in some cases it's okay if it's a really heinous crime. But then you start talking to people who are like, well, you know, capital punishment's a really important tool we have for controlling violent crime. And you find yourself being pulled further and further to an extreme end of a position. This can happen with any kind of controversial issue, and it can certainly happen politically. This picture here is actually an illustration of polarization in a political blogging study. My son was actually involved in his computer science major in looking at analyzing in a visual format the extremism of what happens in social networks, especially in the political realm. So the red is represented by the Republicans and the blue is represented by the Democrats. And you can see there are a few blogs that will cross. There is some crossover, but for the most part, people who are blue will continue to read and educate themselves on attitudes that are consistent with their beliefs. And likewise, people who are, quote, red will do the same. And if we look at their political attitudes over time, we can see that each group becomes more and more extreme in their thinking. There is so much to digest from the information that I presented today, and so much that is applicable to our world and to our lives. And I really hope that you'll think about these things, not only in evaluating your own behavior, but in evaluating the behavior of others and understanding what happens in group dynamics. Thank you so much for your attention today. Have a great day.